Hey everyone, welcome to Sociastrology. Today I wanted to take a look at the full moon in Aries that'll be happening on October 17th. This looks like quite a bit of a doozy. We have several lunations that are coming up in the next month plus. I want to say there's about three that look like they're pretty heavy, pretty strong, and this is going to be a major one. And of course, we are right on the heels of eclipse season. And along those lines, this one actually just missed being an eclipse. So we almost got three eclipses this season. And I think that this one will prove to be just as significant as some of the eclipses that we've been experiencing recently. All of that said, before we dive into it, if you are new here and you like content like this, we cover big important transits as well as political and cultural astrology. Then do stick around by hitting the subscribe button. And if you don't mind hitting the thumbs up button, that really helps me out with the algorithm. It helps the channel to grow. So I very much appreciate that. And it also indicates to me what kind of content that you would like to see more of going forward. But with all of that said, let's dive into it. So, of course, we have this full moon, the sun and moon in opposition here. And we have that taking place within the context of a broader Grand Cross that we have here, which is also formed by an opposition between Mars and Pluto here. So, over the coming weeks, going into November, we're going to be experiencing this opposition between Mars and Pluto getting tighter and tighter and more extreme. And the issue with that is that it is bringing to us some seriously major power struggles, a tendency toward escalation because of the fact that parties are squaring off and they're, not really wanting to give an inch one or the other way. There's a lot of opposition implied by this configuration here. And more extreme. And the issue with that is that it is bringing to us some seriously major power struggles, a tendency toward escalation because of the fact that parties are squaring off and they're, not really wanting to give an inch one or the other way. There's a lot of opposition implied by this configuration here. And I would be very surprised if we get through this period without some major either escalation in some of the conflicts that are ongoing at this point or some major event of violence, socially or globally speaking. Now, I do want to point out that this is set for Washington, D.C. So this is the full moon in Washington. And this has a lot of impact on mundane astrology from a US perspective and with regard to the US. And one thing that we'll notice immediately is that the entirety of this Cardinal Grand Cross configuration, which is made up of these four squares, so from the sun to Mars to the moon here, down to Pluto and back to the sun, and then with each of these with oppositions as well. And this is a configuration of a lot of tension. So it's aligned with all of the angles in Washington, D.C., which does imply that this full moon will be representing some sort of political action for the U.S. to undertake, geopolitical, political, or some sort of confrontation that the government is having to deal with, because we have the sun is rising and the moon is setting at the moment of this exact full moon. And then culminating straight up in the sky will be Mars, and straight down through the earth at the Imam Cooley or the meridian is Pluto. So this is very, very sharp for the US. And I would not be surprised again to see us pulled into a very specific conflict with this. And I would certainly not believe any sort of claims to ignorance about anything that's going on with regard to US allies during this time, as it looks like there's a lot of involvement by the US martially in the matters that are going to be coming up for us around the time of this full moon. So, with all of that said, we could additionally see this play out again in these kind of anti-government ways of, control versus autonomy, various powers squaring off, force that's applied against major significant powers in the world, especially those that tend to exercise a lot of their power behind the scenes. We could certainly see more of the political violence that we've been experiencing in the US election so far. We could see more of that. But ultimately, it's relatively destructive because there's more of a focus here between all of these parties in pursuing their own kind of perspective on the situation rather than much of a desire to get on the same page. Now, this is amplified for one thing by the fact that Mars is in Cancer right now, so it's in a relatively reactive place. I recently did a video on Mars in Cancer that you can check out if you want to know a little bit more about this in particular. But this tends to be quite protective. It tends to lash out toward perceived threats, and it tends to act more on emotion than necessarily long-term goals and perspectives here. And it is squaring off with a very powerful Pluto, a very entrenched Pluto. Pluto's been in Capricorn for the better part of 16 years at this point. I will also point out that it is right around the star Altair, which is in the constellation Aquila, which we associate with the United States. So it's very likely that this Pluto is somehow additionally in geopolitical matters, as it's here representing the, kind of over the top power of the US in these matters as well. Now, this is further complicated by the fact that the full moon in Aries and Mars in Cancer are in mutual reception to each other. So they both rule each other, and they're both in aspect to each other by square. So the conflict omens around this really just add up and add up and add up. I will also point out that recently we had Jupiter retrograde, and then Pluto still hasn't moved from its station. It's about to go direct, but it still hasn't moved. So these two have been really amping up a lot of fundamental, deep-seated power, both for us on a personal level and globally, geopolitically, socially, even it looks like in terms of the weather, which was something that I was quite concerned with, as we had very powerful hurricanes before when we've had Pluto and Jupiter simultaneous stations. So these two have also been exercising a lot of power and really entrenching that recently in their actions. And I do want to point out that this Mars within this configuration is right on at this 22 degrees of Cancer mark, the planetary nodes of Jupiter and Pluto, which are major power points for both Jupiter and Pluto. So there's something that it's hearkening that station that we've just been experiencing from these two, and the immense exaltation of the power of these planets that we've been experiencing recently. Now, the planetary nodes, it's similar to the moon's nodes, which define the eclipse points for our lunar cycles throughout the year. We have just come through eclipse season, and that was because the sun aligned with the nodal axis here as it has moved into Libra. We had a lunar eclipse in Pisces that took place just on the other side of this node. And then we had the Libra new moon eclipse on the 2nd because it was close to this node. So that's what the nodes are, both the lunar nodes and planetary nodes. What they define is the proper, clean alignment of the Earth and the sun, and then a third body. in the case of the lunar nodes, that third body is the moon. In the case of planetary nodes, it's whatever the planet is. So if Jupiter were here and the sun were to come around and conjoin it, then what we would have is all three of our bodies in a perfect line with each other. So if Jupiter was going direct, it would be going directly behind the sun. If Jupiter were going retrograde, it would be passing straight in front of the sun without any difference in the alignment between those three bodies. So that's what the planetary nodes are. I haven't covered them a whole lot in recent videos, but I did want to point that out because it seems to me to really amplify a lot of the power and energy that we've already had at its height throughout the week plus, really the week and a half or 2 weeks leading up to this full moon. So that is also getting triggered. So I definitely want to emphasize strongly how powerful and forceful and relatively extreme this full moon is. This is one of the cases where I would recommend maybe being a little bit careful about crowds. But that's what I'm seeing there in terms of social and geopolitical matters. It looks to me like there's something major escalatory here that could wind up becoming quite destructive, sad to say here. Now, we could also see an increase in explosions, considering we've saw Jupiter and Pluto station, and that is associated with it. And then we have Mars on that nodal point. That could be a major trigger point. If we are able to miss that energy in this week, we may see it actually triggered much more by the full moon. So something to unfortunately keep in mind. And another thing that I do want to say about this moon, just generally speaking, is that it's under a lot of pressure. You know, we look at this as an aspect pattern, sure, but if we look at it just from the moon's perspective, the aspects that it is receiving, it's conjunct to Chiron, which is the wounded healer. It has to do with frustrations and difficult things that we've been through, some major karmic lessons that we've been through, both collectively and personally. And with Chiron and Aries, a lot of that can have to do with war and with aggression. Even in our own personal lives, it can deal with aggression and self-assertion or lack thereof, as well as potential violence and things like that. Now, this moon is coming off of a sextile to Jupiter, which is all well and good, but then one after another, it is having a square that it's applying to Mars, and then it goes exactly full with the opposition to the sun, and then moves straight into a square with Pluto. So this is a very tense area for the moon to be in here, and it's very likely to react to it in a very strong and emotionally driven way, with outbursts and with actions that might not be the wisest. And again, the fact that we have these two, the moon and Mars, in mutual reception there, just really, again, we're layering on very, very similar themes with regard to this, which are, again, around power struggles, conflict, potential violence, and so on and so forth. Now, that's going to be playing out politically and in the world for sure, but that will also be something that we can be experiencing throughout this time in our own personal lives. So we may feel that there is a huge amount of emotional tension for us in this time frame, and we may be feeling very emotional from it and very overwhelmed by the sheer level of somewhat frustrated emotions, way in which our personal relationships are undermining our own sense of self and our own sense of authority over ourselves. Try to simply not deal with those issues at all throughout this period of time. Now, additionally, during this time, this opposition between Mars and Pluto is also forming a kite aspect pattern. And that kite is reaching from Pluto down here. It's opposite to Mars. Mars is trying to Venus. Venus is trying to Neptune. Neptune's trying to Mars. And then down here, we see that we also have sextiles from Venus and from Neptune to this Pluto. And so what this is bringing up is, again, a lot more emotional content and a need to deal with any sort of And again, it's amplifying these emotions in ways that can become pretty deep, pretty poignant, and even upsetting. And one way that I would say that we can work with this energy super constructively is if you are at all a creative type, if you have a creative outlet, this would be an alignment which would feed so much energy into that and a lot of power into it. And I would not shy away from even channeling that frustration into that creativity. So if you are feeling frustrated or blocked or like what's going on in the world is very overwhelming, then channeling that energy into any sort of creative endeavor would be really wonderful. Now, additionally, if you do have relationships that are pretty unquestionably healthy and that you feel are very mutually beneficial and mutually emotionally open, that's another way that could be helpful to channel this energy is to really spend time with those people, to kind of commiserate probably a little bit would be part of this, but even to just, see a movie together or have some kind of experience together that is sentimental, even if you're, just kind of chilling out at home at the end of the day, processing everything that went on. I think that that is one of the best ways to get some level of catharsis out of this and to process a lot of the overwhelming emotion and frustration and potentially even kind of scarier aspects of this that we could be experiencing on a personal level, but certainly on a collective and global level. It's a bit of a toss up if there are any emotional conversations that you need to have with someone. I would wager whether that would go over well or not, depending on how much negative emotion is bound up with that. If it's not a very negative thing, if this is, for instance, a situation where you feel like you want to apologize or something like this, then the energies here are definitely conducive to that coming across with full force and full sincerity. On the other hand, if you are kind of needing to have it out with someone, but you don't want for the situation to snowball into something worse, then I would not time that for around this period of time, because emotions will be too high and there's going to be too much of an oppositional, I'm representing myself, you're representing yourself, and we're not really seeing eye to eye themes going on here. And with this, things can also get really blown out of proportion. Now, additionally, with this Venus, there's just kind of one more thing that I want to point out is that we have just come through and created this basket pattern from Venus opposite to Uranus, which is sextile to Neptune, sextile to Pluto, and then sextile to Venus, which is trine to Neptune, and that Uranus is also trine to Pluto here. So this is a basket formation, and it can be somewhat protective. It can also be a little bit entrenched as an energy of like retreating, into a place of protection here. But I have been picking up with Venus in these late degrees of Scorpio. It will have been processing a lot of what it's been dealing with in this very difficult transit that it's been experiencing through Scorpio here. And as it's in these really late degrees, when it's forming these aspects to the outer planets, which represent social matters, it represents things that are pretty shocking collectively and collective change. It represents trends and things that capture the masses in terms of their imagination and the ideas and so forth, as well as Pluto, which represents a lot of social power as well as personal empowerment and themes like this. So these are very socially oriented planets. They're all the three outer planets that are beyond Saturn. And Venus is simultaneously in contact with all of these. So we will very likely see something about women's quote unquote roles and also their power come up through this in a very collective way. So there could even be some kind of hashtag or meme that goes along with that, where it's just something that is in the moment grabbing the collective attention in a relatively surprising way. And it's going to be something around the power or lack thereof of women and what they're very much capable of, and potentially also what has been rejected to them in the past. So, with Venus in Scorpio, there can be major themes of rejection and so on and so forth, and a lot of emotions and frustration around that. And so I see that is something that's coming through collectively during this period of time. And on a personal level, this would come through as some surprising insights that may come out of nowhere with this opposition between Venus and Uranus around your own role and impact on society, broadly speaking. Now, again, there could be some frustration around that if there are things that are going on in the world that you would love to see just not happening, as I very much hope is the case for a lot of us right now. And there may be a sense of helplessness and frustration around that. But on the other hand, some ideas may come through of how you could have some sort of impact even on those broader issues, but certainly on the way that you see your own role within the world and the way that you relate to others. And this would be something that would be experienced as a somewhat new idea that does seem like it just kind of feels right with the trine to Neptune here. It's something that's pretty compelling. It's something that you're relatively comfortable with. But additionally, with the sextile to Pluto, this would be about recognizing your own personal impact on things, on the world around you, if you want to focus more locally, if you want to get involved with something, or even to just see yourself differently and see your power over your own life within the context of society somewhat differently throughout this period of time as well. And this is super tight. This sextile is only 3 minutes off, and this Venus will definitely be sextiling this Pluto while it's still stationed and it's still at this point. And that's going to be very strong because they're both in these this last degree of their respective signs. And so I think that there's going to be, especially with women in particular, and maybe for men out there, this might be something to kind of keep in mind and maybe try not to step on toes about if it's something that comes through pretty sharply, is again this kind of frustration that Venus has been experiencing in Scorpio coming through in a pretty sharp way of, no, I'm not going to accept that. This is what I'm wanting for myself, and that's what I'm going to go after, because, any sort of outmoded sense of myself or sense that society has of me and my own role, I'm just going to kind of throw that out right now. So do understand, for the men out there, if that's something you encounter, maybe just steer a little bit clear of it. And then for women out there, this may be something that you do kind of personally experience again in this relatively cathartic way, as this is a major healthy release point for the pent-up energies that we're experiencing in this conflictual opposition between Mars and Pluto here. And this is something that we will be experiencing on and off over the coming months, this opposition between Mars and Pluto. This will be the last one that we have, as they are in Cancer and Capricorn. And then, as far as I'm remembering, we're going to have at least one more. It might just be one more opposition between the two of them as Mars comes back into the early degrees, the first degree of Leo, and it will oppose Pluto once it's in the first degree of Aquarius there. So this is a theme that we're going to have for a while, this conflict here. And I will just say, on a personal level, it scares the heck out of me personally, given the way that things are in the world. And if that's also something that is upsetting and unsettling to you, I do want to offer some hope and have it be based in reality of, yeah, this aspect isn't really going anywhere for a long time. It's pretty much going to be an orb for a while, at least until, I'm thinking, next spring, maybe even a little bit later than that. But what we really do need to keep in mind as things look daunting in the world, or as they start to look somewhat scary, is that we do have a huge change coming in this year. Pluto finally, for the last time, moving into Aquarius. It won't go back into Capricorn. So there are a lot of powers within society that are going to be experiencing a sharp fall in these last degrees until November. From then on, a lull, a major lull in their power. A lot of this would be bound up with bankers and old money and old power, the kind of entrenched status quo, globally speaking, is going to be waning in the coming years. And of course, there's going to be reactions to that, and they're not going to be very comfortable, but we are eventually, we're pushing through, we're moving on through that. Additionally, Neptune will be moving into Aries, and Uranus, perhaps most fortunately, will be moving into Gemini. And this really does rebalance a lot of the power here. This is sadly associated still with conflict, but it's always somehow conflict that it leads to something better when Uranus moves into Gemini. So I again will always emphasize that we have full choice. There's no need for these transits to be expressed in war. And if my, Star Trek dreams play out, then, maybe there will be a day in which we can see this express in ways other than that, where we can get the social progress without having to fight for it. But that is progress, what Uranus moving into Gemini ultimately will bring for us. And this Neptune is also going to become just a lot more active in the coming years. And I think that much as it can be a little bit scary as planets move in terms of mundane astrology, no offense to any Aries people out there, into Aries, just because it is strongly associated with war, but it's also very strongly associated with pioneering and with individuality and with, claiming power for oneself. One thing that's been frustrating about the placement of these planets recently is they are in these very receptive signs of like society and the masses just kind of accepting how things are, accepting that status quo that has so much power. And as these planets start moving forward, we're going to be focusing a lot more on no, look, the way that things have been going, it's not working for us. We need for things to change. We can't just stick with the status quo. And so there's going to be definitely a huge push toward progress, even if there's some conflict along the way. Now, lastly, for the sake of looking forward to the future, because I do feel like even the outer planets moving into the new signs, it's very exciting. It's going to be an excellent change. But because it involves that conflict, it's a little bit of an early mixed bag. Next eclipse season looks quite nice. So once we start getting into like the middle of February, Pisces season next year looks really, really pleasant. And so that is certainly something that we can look forward to. We will have moved through a lot of conflict, certainly, but we will have a much clearer vision of where things are at and what we're dealing with, rather than just kind of being on the edge of so much that's changing and going on in the States and that's really up in the air, as well as things that are up in the air globally. I think that as we will, I'm almost certain, be experiencing this month as a little bit daunting and overwhelming because of the fact that emotions are high, and yet the future is up in the air right now and we don't know how things are going to play out, that we will at the very least know more of what we're dealing with in a short period of time. So I'm hoping that there is some level of silver lining that you've been able to get out of that. I will likely, I don't cover every lunation. I don't cover every full moon or new moon, but when they look really impactful like this, or it's an eclipse or something like that, I'll definitely be covering them. So I expect to be covering the new moon that's on the 1st of November. And then we have another very interesting full moon coming up in November. So I'll definitely be covering those as well, as we kind of continue to move through and work through a lot of the stuck energies that we will be seeing shaken loose in the coming months here. So with all of that said, that is pretty much what I have for this full moon in Aries. I hope that it treats you very well. I hope that it treats the world very well. Without a doubt, definitely be praying and doing whatever supplication or request or thoughts and so forth that aligns with you for peace. And do remember, you know, when the news gets rough, to take the breaks that you need and to give yourself permission to do that. Get into something that you enjoy, to go outside, to get some air, because I think it's going to be quite important in the coming month for us to go easy on ourselves personally and on others that we are interacting with directly. So anything that we can personally do to that end is going to be quite important in these coming months, especially if you are very emotionally invested in any of the multitude issues that are being experienced right now globally. So with all of that said, I will leave it here. Thank you so much for being here and for the subscribes, the likes, the encouraging comments. I do really want to emphasize just how much that means to me. I really appreciate that. And yeah, again, I hope you have a wonderful full moon, and I will talk to you soon. Be good. Bye.